If you've ever thought to yourself, I'd rather just read about this than actually do it, you're not alone. The Enneagram 5 newsletter exists to help you move from knowing to experiencing. Every Saturday, you'll get insights designed to help fives grow without overwhelm. Sign up for free today at enneagram5.com/newsletter or visit the link in the description. Now on to the show. All right, Cody, I don't know about you, but I'm very excited about this conversation.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for now 2 seasons.
We are back with our special guest, Sam Greenberg, aka the Enneagram Sexpert. So thank you, Sam, for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me back.
So we had such a great time talking last season in the episode Sex.
Yeah, it was so fun.
That was real fun. Got real personal, but it was good. And I think we got a ton of feedback on that episode and people really found it valuable. So we thought it would be fun to have Sam back on, and who's someone who is actually an Enneagram expert, because Cody and I are not. And we wanted to talk about one of the big requests that we've had on this show is to dig into subtypes. And so that's what we're going to do right now.
Great.
All right, so let's start with the question that many people are probably asking at this point. What are subtypes, and how does that fit into what we know about the Enneagram?
Okay, great. So there's 3 dominant instincts that form our subtypes. And those are the self-preservation instinct, the sexual instinct, also sometimes called the one-to-one instinct, and the social instinct. And any of the 9 Enneagram types can be any of the instincts. So there's 27 combinations. And the idea behind this is that instincts are almost more in our mammalian brain or our animal self, whereas the type is more in our ego defenses. So some people now think that instincts are even a little bit deeper or more instinctual, if you will, than type, because they have to do with evolutionary drives.
Okay.
It's interesting.
So to recap, there are 3 instincts that make up our subtypes.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, and the 3 S's. So social, sexual, and self-preservation.
That's right. The self-preservation instinct is like the resource acquisition and maintenance instinct. So like these are things that ancient humans had, whereas type may not be something that cavemen had, right? So it's like the hunter-gatherer instinct. Self-pres is like the hunter-gatherer instinct. So that's related to the physical needs, the body, monitoring. It's your basic survival drive, basically. How to support the self. And also, where's your energy going? Where is it invested in? Do you have enough? Which is, of course, also a 5 thing. We'll talk about that. And then the sexual instinct is like the reproductive or mating instinct. So that has to do with chemistry, attraction, desire, intensity, and sort of intimacy in a sense. And that's people who like to like connect really intensely and really deeply one-on-one. And the stereotype is that they can be a little bit too much, like overshare, bright colors, like a little bit too much. And that, but this is general. We'll talk about how it applies to 5. And then the social instinct is the social cohesion community kind of instinct in the species, which, primates have this still. So that's about how you exist in interconnection, belonging, connection, your place in community, how you're accepted by your group, and if you're accepted by your group, sort of empathy with others. And the stereotype around this is people who are like very approachable and always making sure everyone in the group is happy and doing okay. So it's the hunter-gatherer instinct, the mating instinct, and the social cohesion instinct that sort of go with each.
Awesome. Okay, so let's dig into each one of those from the 5 perspective.
Okay, great. So maybe self-preservation first, because self-preservation 5s are like the fiviest 5s. So they're the easiest to diagnose or type from the outside looking in, and I think also from the inside looking at yourself. They're extremely self-contained. And of course, 5s are all very self-contained, but they're extremely self-contained, the most self-contained of the 3 subtypes. They're the most usually reclusive and introverted of the 3 subtypes, the most likely to be staying at home because they have this whole thing about being in walls, like being in an enclosed safe space, whether metaphorically or literally. And they're usually much more, even more sensory sensitive than other 5s. Again, 5s tend to all be very sensitive, but self-pres 5s are the most. They are more likely, because I said self-pres in general, it's about the body, monitoring the physical state and the body's needs. Self-pres 5s are more likely than the other 2 subtypes to be into the body, into regular exercise or food or cooking, into their home. But again, 5s usually sometimes neglect these things, and self-preservation 5s, when they're unhealthy, can like actively neglect them. So it can be kind of tricky if you're trying to figure out which one you are. Healthy self-preservation 5s like are the only 5s that probably exercise regularly, unless like you've been to therapy and your therapist told you to, then you're probably doing it. But self-pres 5s sometimes are doing it because they're more into the body. And then if they're unhealthy, they can like actively neglect eating, and their house falls into disrepair, and they sort of neglect caring for the self. So it can go either way.
When you say actively neglect, like what do you mean?
Like they start to live around the everyday needs. So like stepping over messes, and like the microwave breaks, and instead of fixing it, they just don't use the microwave for 20 years. Like again, all 5s can do this. Like I'm telling you, this is the most fiviest of the 5s, the fiviest of the 5s. It just in terms of stereotypes, it's the fiviest, but that's what I mean by actively neglect. Like it just slides into like disregard, I guess. Because self-preservation 5s struggle the most of all 3 subtypes of 5 with having enough energy to handle everyday tasks. I think like energy and resource issues are the biggest for them, because for all self-pres people of any type, they're aware of where their energy is going and like, how am I spending it? So, and we know 5s are like this. So this is extra heightened in a self-preservation 5. Some more things about them. All 3 subtypes of 5 have a way that they want their skills and intellect to be applied. And for self-pres 5s, they want their skills and intellect to create a sustainable living for them. Sometimes they even like have live workspaces, like they live in their studio or whatever, because they're really concerned with like, okay, I'm a 5, I have these areas of interest and specialty, but like, how can I make them work for me to create a sense of safety, basically. And they can come to view all social interaction, even basic things like eating, as a distraction from their special areas of focus.
So I feel like this is where we've described being a 5 as feeling like just sort of a head floating above a body.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's when we're kind of getting into the self-preservation instinct a bit.
Yes. And I mean, we do all have all 3 of these in us. It's just that we have a dominant one. So a lot of us are doing all of these behaviors.
Gotcha.
Also, another stereotype about self-pres people is they're the least communicative of the 3 subtypes. Like they're the least likely to share themselves, the most likely to be doing stuff secretively so they don't have to share themselves. Again, all 5s tend to do that, but self-pres 5s the most. And they love, more than other subtypes of 5, they love unstructured time, like long, uninterrupted periods of focus. So when I said they're self-contained, it's like they're really self-contained. Like even their intellectual pursuits don't need to be shared. They just want to make sure that they can have a life, like feed themselves, basically. They don't really care that much about what happens with them outside of that. They want to pursue them, and they want to use them to create a sustainable living. That's it.
And so to them, it doesn't really matter much how that affects others or if they share that with other people.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely gotten into that mode sometimes.
We'll talk about this more, but I'm already much clearer on what my stacking is.
Yeah, I have strong feelings about what Cody's stacking is, so we'll talk about that.
Oh, okay.
Actually, both of you, I have like educated guesses, but we could try
Educated guesses.
We can try to figure
All
it
right.
out.
So yeah, for everyone listening, we'll save that to the end. We'll do we'll see if we can figure that out. Because this is something that Cody and I have gone back and forth on, and we've talked about in the community. I think we've talked about it on some episodes. Like we have a kind of maybe a general understanding of what we think our stacking might be, but neither of us have really taken the time to dive in and figure that out, which is why we're excited about this conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
My name is, and I'm a self-preservation. And I'm a self-preservation. But I'm a self-preservation subtype. My name is, and I'm a self-preservation subtype.
I'm a self-preservation subtype primarily, followed by social, then sexual. And how does it show up for me as a 5? Fierce independence that I wasn't even aware of. Years ago when I went through a divorce, I remember someone saying to me, "You've prepared for this moment all your life." And I asked why, and the reply was, "You haven't broken down like many people do, and you have so many safeguards in place, you've kept moving." It bothered me when I heard that, but I realized there was some truth to that. And while I don't go around calling myself fiercely independent, on some level I am, even if I don't articulate it directly. I fear being needy, yet have no problem helping anyone in need. The mere thought of having to depend on someone causes anxiety, and I say almost an anaphylactic reaction. The first time that I heard about the Enneagram, I felt exposed, especially when I read the self-preservation subtype.
I am a self-preservation subtype. I have a hard time accepting help or support from even my spouse. And I have this thought that if I accept someone's help, even his help, then that means that I'm indebted to him, and I am working past that. It's been a challenge of mine. I'm also big on privacy. I have a guest room in my house, and I hate it whenever someone asks if they can stay in my guest room. I am also trying to become a better and more gracious host to people. And then I'm also big into preparing. I'm constantly afraid I'm not going to be prepared for some scenario. I plan my outfits and meals and so many plans for weeks in advance. And I also check my bank account about 2 times a day, every day. And I've been planning for my retirement since I was in my 20s because I am so anxious about not being able to provide for myself when it comes time to retire. And I've also read that self-preservation subtypes have a lot of problems with anger, and anger feels like a bad, not a bad emotion, but like a wrong emotion, like a dirty emotion. And I relate to that as well. I definitely don't like being angry, and it takes me a while to admit when I am feeling anger.
Okay, so that's self-preservation. Let's do the sexual one next. What is that?
Okay, so the sexual subtype of 5 is what's called the counter type. So also for every single Enneagram type, all the numbers, there's one of the 3 subtypes that's called the counter type. And that means that people of that subtype don't look as much like the stereotype of the type. They tend to go against the stereotypes a little bit. and sometimes are harder to identify. So the sexual five's the hardest to diagnose, especially from the outside looking in. From the inside, I think it's pretty clear I'm a sexual dominant five, but it is the counter type. So sexual subtypes in general are seeking chemistry. And this is often described as romantic chemistry, but it doesn't have to be. It's sort of intimacy and spark and chemistry in general, usually always with just one person at a time, though. And sexual dominant people of all types, when they're in a new situation, say a new group of people, they tend to have like a radar for who in that group they can connect with the most in this way that they like. So sexual fives are like that as well. But they're sort of seeking that chemistry without the burdens of normal social interaction and relationships. That's the difference.
What do you mean?
So they want like this extremely intense, deep connection, but they don't want you to like text them every day. So they will go really deep and intense and then disappear to kind of get that space that fives need. Whereas sexual subtypes of a lot of the other types will just like want to be in that connection all the time.
I definitely leaned into this a lot in my younger years.
Oh, really?
I was a really annoying teenager to try to date.
I think we all were. That's probably another different episode.
Yeah. Probably. Early 20s, I was a disaster. And it was all because of this particular, I was leaning into this real heavily, probably.
Gotcha. Yeah, so this is the least self-contained of the fives because they sort of need someone else to do this, but actually they don't all the way, because another big difference between sexual fives and sexual other types is that sexual fives can have this all going on in their own mind, and actually they don't even need the other person to know about it. So they do often have, like entanglements, intimate entanglements with real people, but they can just become sort of like, obsessed is a little bit of an extreme word, but like very, very interested in someone that they feel like they have chemistry with, and they just have like a whole relationship with them in their head. And that does, for fives, kind of fulfill the need of the sexual. In terms of what they want their intellectual pursuits to do, for sexual five, they want their intellectual pursuits to change their own and other people's sense of self. They don't even just want it to change their views, which is what socials do, which maybe we should have done social first, but socials want to change people's views. Sexuals want to change your sense of self. So sexual is really about going without boundaries, like kind of going beneath boundaries or dissolving boundaries. So as a sexual five, we want our intellectual area to change other people's like being, basically.
Okay, I see you smirking because I think I know what you think I am. But we'll get...
Eek.
We
okay.
Keep going.
So
I've got my own theory at this point too of what you are.
Yeah, I have a couple of theories. So side note, I thought this would be very easy to talk about because I'm a sexual, but when I started taking notes, I felt extremely self-conscious.
Yeah.
So I wrote down a quote from a book to read because I was like, I can't take my own notes on this. So for sexual fives, the quote is, ideas, concepts, and other forms of mental engagement often expressed with an artistic flair are imbued with some form of erotic charge. So I'm just going to like sink into the floorboards, but I'm a scientist. So yeah, so the idea is like the same brainy five, but with like a little bit of like a sexual edge to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you do call yourself the Enneagram
sexpert,
right?
yeah.
So like, it's pretty clear what you're.
I know. It's terrible. The same book said sexual fives can come to approach the erotic like conceptually, which is what I do with my entire life. So I'm just a stereotype of myself.
You're a stereotype of the counter type of yourself.
Exactly.
What does that mean though to approach it to conceptually? I'm kind of curious about that,
like,
actually.
To intellectualize it. So like
Yeah.
I'm literally a social scientist who studies sex and then tells you about it with concepts.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That's fair.
Yeah. And then I guess the last thing I'll say about this is sexual fives can view interpersonal chemistry as like something that helps the generation of new ideas for them. So it's not like they have their mind world and then they have their chemistry world. They're really interrelated, and they feel like that sort of juice of connection with others helps generate their way of thinking about things and novel ideas and helps them kind of process intellectually. So it's all related for them.
It's really interesting. I've been most curious about this particular type because I think I understand it the least. I feel like the other descriptions of social and self-pres, I feel like are fairly easy to understand the concept of like what that looks like in daily life. But the sexual one was always the hardest for me to like try to conceptualize, to try to like imagine in my head what that looks like to be primarily a sexual 5 and what that looks like on a daily basis, like how you just interact with life, I guess. And that's always been really kind of more in the gray area. So this has been much more enlightening. I appreciate that.
That's probably because you are sexual repressed, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
For me, I have the really hard time understanding the self-preservation 5s because I'm self-preservation repressed, so that makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Oh, so you were using that as a technical term about subtypes and not saying that Cody was sexually repressed.
No, not at all. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
No. Well, I don't know.
'Cause that's how I took it.
You may be, but that's you may or may not be. But I meant sexual instinct repressed.
Got you. Okay. Just to clarify.
Sorry about that. That came across way more harsh than I meant to.
My name is, and I'm a sexual subtype. My name is, and I'm a sexual subtype.
And I'm a sexual subtype.
I'm a sexual 5, and last year I had a sticky situation where I became infatuated with one of my friends, and I didn't realize it was really happening until a little bit later when I'm very cognizant about how I talk about this person to other people, and I'm thinking, oh no, am I sounding like I am a bit too enthusiastic about what we talked about? Am I always mentioning this person? Is it really obvious that I'm getting this infatuation or have this infatuation? And this person was actually engaged to be married. And I had to really self-evaluate and analyze because I love this friend of mine. And I was having such a hard time just thinking about the fact that we connect so well. And whenever our energy is just so compatible when we're together hanging out, that it's hard for me to divorce the infatuation from reality. And I know in my head that what reality is, and he's just my friend, and I really like and enjoy spending time with him. But there's this other part of me, like my energy level just gets bigger and I get excited because I have this connection with this person. And there's just this idealized, romanticized thing that I'm going through. So I've had to actually stop some of my communication with him and step back a bit because of this, because he's married now. And it's just weird otherwise.
I'm a sexual 5, and it has really changed my life to learn that this is my subtype, because the sexual 5 is the counter type. It's not the commonly seen 5s that you see represented or talked about in Enneagram circles. We're not as necessarily obsessed with like science and math and like all this higher learning. We're obsessed with people. And I always was just so confused because I know I'm a 5, but when I'd read about other 5s, I didn't connect with those things. Not really. And I always felt like I'm the dumb 5. All these other 5s are doing higher thinking and doing amazing things in the world. And I'm just sitting around here making a lot of friends and having great conversations with people. And it felt kind of like, am I not using all my 5 gifts? But I am. So I love the sexual subtype of 5s. Like, we are interested in things, but it's people. And so sexual 5s are oxymorons because we love to not be around people, but we also love to be around people. And I appreciate that I can kind of straddle both worlds. And when I connect with people, it's deep and meaningful. And people love that. It's so rare in this world for people to really connect personally. And I love that sexual 5s can do that with people.
So I guess social fives, I'll talk a little bit about that. So social fives are technically the most outgoing of the 5 subtypes. Now, again, we're talking about 5. So that doesn't mean you're an outgoing person. It just means you're outgoing comparatively to the other 2. And these people are the best at navigating socially, even if they don't like it. They sort of are better at knowing how to navigate social situations. These people want their intellectual pursuits to offer insight and understanding to others and to the world at large. So they have more of a calling, like my intellectual interests are only interesting if I can exchange ideas with other people. They believe, like I said, that understanding needs to be shared and exchanged in order to be meaningful. So they often become teachers. They don't mind a good debate about ideas. And more than the other 2 subtypes, they really like engaging about ideas with other people as long as they respect the people. So they can be a little bit snobby about mastery, like they really respect mastery. So they want to engage with other people they consider to be experts in different fields. And then they really get a lot from exchanging ideas. They want to be part of elite groups, often members of elite groups, whereas the other 2 5 subtypes basically are not interested in groups of any kind. And they do consider the social value of their contributions to the world. Like they want to kind of claim their place or their niche in the world, whatever their intellectual expertise is. They think about the impact it has on others. They also tend to be more kind of with it, like more up to date on trends, on not following them, but know them. They know what's going on with politics and science. Like they tend to just be a little bit more like a part of things. Whereas again, like self-preservation and sexual fives can be a little bit of cultural renunciates, I'd say. Like they just don't care as much about that stuff.
Cultural renunciate. I've never heard that term before.
Oh, I just made it up now.
Love it.
And I guess the last thing about social fives is that they can over-focus on like concepts and intellectualizing things socially because they are more social as a social subtype. They can over-relate socially using their intellect. And then when other people want to actually relate emotionally or in another way, then social fives can become a bit alienated.
All right. I'm having a little trouble grasping that. So what you're saying is that, like, how do they over-focus on or over-relate socially? What do you mean?
Not over-relate socially, over-relate intellectually when they're trying to relate socially. So they're just too 5-y in their socializing in groups.
Okay.
And then they can become socially alienated because of that.
So like somebody who is talking about whatever it is they're passionate about for way too long and everybody else glosses over and starts a new conversation and leaves them out of it and leaves them behind.
Yeah, it could be that, although I think a self-pres 5 would also do that.
That's probably true, yeah.
'Cause-
I'm just stabbing in the dark here. That's obviously something that's never happened to me before.
Completely hypothetical situation.
Completely hypothetical.
But yes, exactly.
I'm a social 5. One thing that stands out for me is that something that Beatrice Chestnut mentions, that social 5s admire people who express their ideals. I've always admired my teachers in particular. I've also been interested in social sciences such as political science, sociology, and anthropology for a long time, which is probably a way of being interested in people from a distance.
I think for me as a social 5, it shows up in a couple different ways. I tend to be a little bit more outgoing, I think, than maybe the general 5. I do like bouncing ideas off of people who have similar thoughts to me. But I also want to make sure that I have groups that really understand and have a good understanding of different situations. So, for example, I could be part of a comic book group, and, I love Marvel Comics, so I'm going to find people who not only have a knowledge of Marvel Comics, but as they have a deeper knowledge of that than I do, and I want to learn more from them to get as close to being an expert in it than maybe an average person. I have problems with people who only have partial knowledge of things. I don't really want to talk to people who may pretend that they have a lot of knowledge on something, but they really don't. I'll go to experts, and I want to hang around people who have that knowledge, who are experts in their field, so I can learn from them. But I don't want to be around people who don't have a lot of knowledge on the topic that I'm looking for, or, if they're not, and I hate to say this, it sounds a little bad, but if they're not as strong as I am in that area, then I'm not going to get their advice. I'm not going to take their advice from them.
All right. So we've recapped then self-preservation, sexual, social.
Yes.
One thing that I know that we wanted to talk through is stacking, because I know that we tend to, at least a lot of the conversations that I've been a part of online and whatnot around the subtype topic is people tend to focus on like, I'm this subtype or I'm that subtype, but we're all kind of a combination, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a stacking involved. So can you talk about how that works?
Yes. So there's 3 subtypes, obviously, and then you have them in order. So you would have one that's the most, that's your dominant. Then you have one that's secondary. And the secondary one sort of supports the dominant one. And then you have a third below that is often called the repressed or the blind spot instinct. And that's the one that you have arguably the least and that you have sort of the most issues with. So it comes like the least naturally. And one way to think about which one you might have that's repressed is when you see other people who are really big with that instinct that you have repressed, you kind of don't get it. Like Cody was saying, like, I just don't understand that. Or you think that they're silly or you make fun of them. Like it just doesn't resonate with you and your way of operating. So that would be your repressed one. Dominant one is the one that comes the most naturally and that you're sort of doing like automatically.
Okay. So dominant, and then you said that the second one supports
secondary.
The dominant one?
Yeah, it's the one that you have the second most, but it also often serves to support your dominant. So I'll use myself as an example. I'm a sexual dominant, and then social, and then self-preservation repressed. So for me, the social instinct is just like, yes, I sort of know how to navigate social situations. I don't mind doing it. I don't mind groups, but I use that ability to just find the person that I can really connect with. So it's like I have it, but it siphons towards my actual dominant one, which is what I really want to be doing.
Okay. And one question that I have is, does that stacking change over time, or is this something that's more fixed? Like, how does that work?
This was also my question.
Yeah, I've heard different theories about this. I think it's worth noting that this is newer theory. So the Enneagram itself has ancient roots, but at least the 1960s and stuff is when types started getting fleshed out. This stuff is much more recent, so you can't go and find as many books on it or as much resourcing on it. So I wouldn't say that there's an absolute consensus about that question, but what I normally hear is that it can shift, especially as you age and especially as you work on yourself. But my feeling is that the dominant one usually stays dominant. And I think maybe the other two can move around. That's just my personal feeling. So some people think it's more fixed, some people think it can change.
Okay. Well, is it time?
Has the time come?
I think we're here at the point in the conversation where Cody and I get put on the spot.
Love that.
I'm going to make Cody go first.
Of course you are.
So I think a good way to figure out your stacking is to figure out your dominant instinct and then to figure out your repressed instinct. And then whatever the other one is just going to be the middle one.
Yeah. So we could talk about this more in depth, but I'm pretty confident in what my dominant one is actually at this point, especially. I was going back and forth before, but the more you talked about it, I was just like, I know exactly which one I've been my entire life.
Which one is that?
The most. self-pres.
Yeah, that's it.
Without a doubt. And so much so that like as I got older, it didn't diminish. It's only gotten more intense because I'm concerned about getting older and trying to be more in shape and trying to take care of my body. And I've been in the gym like 4 times this week, and I'm going to therapy. All these things are very front of mind for me at this point, but I've always been that way, especially with a 6-wing like self-pres. That anxiety, that undertone of anxiety that's always present there kind of keeps me super self-aware and a little bit of a hypochondriac. So there's always a little bit of self-pres there. And I also love, I've talked about this, I don't even know how many times on this podcast about how much I love my space. And like before we had this 2-bedroom apartment, I had to go and like have my own workspace that was separate, because otherwise I was just like feeling intensely unhealthy and not okay. And because I didn't have my own space, and that, like, the physical walls thing really kind of spoke to me. I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, that's definitely me. So that's got to be the dominant.
I agree. So when I first met you guys, you were saying that you thought you were both social. And I could sort of see that, but then when I was even preparing for this episode, I was like, Cody has definitely self-pres.
Yeah. I don't know if I ever was on board with the being social. Yeah, it has to be self-pres as the dominant one for me, for sure.
Yeah.
There's just no other way to talk about it. No other way to look at it than that.
So based on the fact that you were saying, sexual 5s or just the sexual instinct to you doesn't make so much sense, and it's like the one you have the hardest time understanding what it would look like on a daily basis, and also just because I had an intuition that you might be sexual instinct blind, let's play that out for a second.
I would like to dig into that, yeah, because when I say that I didn't understand, and so I've looked at it in so many different ways and truly believed at different times in my life I was leaning into that so heavily that I may have been more dominant that way, because I used to very much enjoy like those deep one-on-one conversations and looking for those connections when I was younger. And also the fact that I'm an artist and I love communicating my deeper thoughts that I don't want to say out loud through music and through my art, rather than trying to say it out loud in a conversation. Like to some of the things that I'm putting in songs right now in my life, I don't want to talk about out loud, but to put it in music seems padded. I think that's what's kind of thrown me off, is like that kind of misleading part of it, right? So I feel like there's parts of it that I do understand, and I've always felt very, very easily could lean into like my 4-wing too. And I know that sexual 5s tend to be more 4-ish or whatever.
True, yeah.
And so that's always been something that's made me wonder if it's not my secondary, and also because like I've always been deeply social averse in general. Like I just don't enjoy social interactions, and I do sometimes, and I have to be in the mood, but it's like usually when I'm disintegrating to a 7, and then I'm all about like impulsiveness and being in party scenarios. But like as I get older, that gets less and less, right? And so it's harder for me to identify socially, but and even like you could say, like, because I'm on a podcast, I look at the podcast as another form of art. And so it actually falls into the sexual bucket more than it does the social bucket in my mind, at least the way that I, separate those things.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that point, just because normally it's just you and I sitting down having a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think about an audience ever hearing the things that we talk about. And even when we're sitting down and doing it, and like we have these moments when we're doing these one-on-one conversations where I really get into it and I really love it. But the entire lead up to that, I'm dreading it every single time. And then when I'm editing it, I'm dreading that anyone's ever going to hear it. So it's always like definitely kind of a weird constant cycle of just inner turmoil that I have to deal with on a daily basis with this podcast.
So we definitely pause and like figure out the differences between 5 things, like just 5 traits, and social traits or sexual traits. Because I like also relate to everything you're saying as a sexual dominant. Like whenever I do put posts on Instagram and then someone I know messages me about it and says, I saw your post, I'm like, what? How?
Yeah, I totally get that.
They're like, because it's on an absolutely public place. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, I can't. So social 5s are not extroverted. Like they say that any type can be introverted or extroverted. That's technically true. There's, I'm sure, a handful of extroverted 5s somewhere. But every 5 I've ever met, talked to, or worked with is introverted. So a social 5 isn't going to enjoy social interaction like an extrovert would. It's more that they would consider their social place, their sort of social location. They would consider what other people maybe think of them a little bit, and they'd consider how what they do impacts others, and that they are quite drawn to like the elite groups and stuff like that. But it's not that they enjoy socializing, and that's the case for any social instinct dominant person who's introverted. So there's that thing to parse out. But I hear what you're saying about how you enjoyed those like deep and intimate connections. And that does sound maybe more like you could be sexual second. So social repressed people, which is what you would be if you had sexual second, social repressed people tend to have this sort of bafflement about what they're supposed to do at any given moment. They don't understand why they sometimes say things that like don't go over well. Like they don't understand where they're supposed to stand or like what they're supposed to say or do. So social 5s or 5s that don't have social repressed would be like a little bit less baffled by that stuff.
Okay. Well, then while we're on the topic of repression, what does a sexually repressed 5 look like? So that'll bring some light to what I'm about to say.
This is hard stuff. I'm by no means like a super expert on this, but a sexual repressed 5, so a stacking with that self-pres and then social and then sexual, that's actually the most 5 stacking. Because these people sort of like lack the charisma almost that a lot of people have. They sort of have a little bit more of like a flat affect. And these tend to fit the stereotype of like the brainy, bookish, or like alone in their house doing their thing.
I'm not sure I'm taking this I'm starting to take this as an insult that you thought I was sexually repressed.
No, I'm so sorry.
No charisma at all. Definitely should not go outside. Wants to stay inside all the time even.
Oh, I'm sorry. I also don't really understand sexual repressed people because I'm sexual dominant. So
right. Yeah.
There's just like a little bit less of an like intensity to them. So people say people of the other two. So self-present social people sometimes say like sexual people come on so strong and that like I want to take a step back from them.
Okay. And that's definitely enlightening for sure.
That wouldn't be exactly as true of a sexual 5 because I'm like still a 5, but for the other two subtypes, like a sexual 5 seems a little too fiery, I'd say. So a sexual repressed 5 would just be more of like have more of a solidity and less of like a fieriness to them.
Okay, well that's really interesting to me. One of the things that does stick in my mind that is confusing for me between secondary and what is secondary is the fact that anytime that I am passionate about something and learn about this thing in depth as I do often, the first thing that I want to do is tell somebody.
Okay. Yeah, that's very social.
And then all I want to do is go on about it until they no longer care if I'm alive. So like it's I just push it way beyond the boundary of I just talk about it, like, and the things that I can talk about, I can list them off. I could have a whole podcast on any of these given things. Music, anything music related, anything movie related, anything Marvel or DC related. All of these things that only a very small amount of people care about. But I will talk about it forever. And so it's got to be like, and it sucks because I just go around all the time knowing these things that I can't talk about because I know nobody gives a shit. So it's like one of these things it's definitely a bit of a struggle. But yeah, I mean, but it's so hard because it's like, does that drive and motivate me? Like, I don't know because, you talk about like instinctual and how like deeply rooted those things are going to be and how they define you as a person, right? So are those the things that really define me, or is the thing about, because like I also on the flip side of that have always said, I've said this to Josiah recently, like it doesn't matter where I get in life when I think about it, and it doesn't matter what I'm doing, how much I love my job, however much I love my life in general, I would in a split second, if somebody came to me and said, I'm going to give you full reign to do music for a living and like spend all of your time and energy pouring into that. If you want to, it's your choice right now. I would implode my life at any given moment to do that. Like that is always the most driving factor in my life, is that I want to do art and create art and communicate anything that I'm thinking or feeling through that mode of communication, I guess, and expression, mode of expression above all else. And so I would rather do that than have a conversation. I'd rather do that and that kind of falls into how I connect with other people. And I feel most connected when people understand me through that mode of expression rather than like me talking to them or sitting with them and spending quality time with them. Like that's not my number one thing. That's not what I care about the most. And so that's why it's been so hard for me to decide between the two of them and understand it, because like for me to not understand the sexual 5 as much, but then also deeply feel so many parts of it is really weird for me.
That's all very self-pres of you.
Yeah.
The whole thing about like, all I want is to use my passion to make a living. Like you didn't say
Right,
like,
yeah.
if
when you said that.
Yeah, you didn't say like if someone said I'll like cut you a record deal so that like millions of people hear it. You said like would pay me, like make a living doing
Sure.
it.
And a lot of that comes from just conditioning, right? Like I'm in my 30s, like I know that I can't do it. I've never been the person in my life who was like, I'm willing to be very poor and do this because I want to share this with the world. It's always been practical. I've always been self-preservation. It has to pay the bills and put food in my mouth, put food on the table, right? And so, yeah, definitely self-preservation first. That's without question. And it's definitely expressed there for sure, because yes, I want to share it with the world. Yes, I would love it if everybody like really got into it and really got something out of it and was as passionate about it as I am, but on the receiving end. But the primary thing is that stops me from doing that and stops me from being able to do that is the fact that I know it has to be practical. It has to provide. And so, but the thing about it is that makes me self-preservation. Even when you said that earlier, I was thinking like, you know, I love playing video games. So the first thing that it's the way that I connect with my brother who's across the country and all these things. But the first thing that I thought when I started like really, I was like, well, if I'm going to spend X amount of time playing video games, then I need to figure out a way to monetize it. So I started getting into live streaming and like, so every bit of my passions always has to be practical or I don't give it as much time in my life.
I wanted to go back to what you were saying about sharing your interests just in the pursuit of maybe figuring out your secondary. But okay. I keep going back and forth. So you said like the first thing I do when I learn something new is I want to share it. That's totally social instinct. But then you said, and talk till they no longer care if I'm alive. That wouldn't be the social instinct, because if you like don't care how the other person feels about it, then that's not so much. And then you went back and said, I want to do that all the time, but I don't do that because I know people don't like it, which is back to the social instinct. Like you're thinking about what's okay to do socially.
Yeah. Hence my confusion.
Yeah. We may not be able to nail it down.
Do you want my opinion?
Sure.
Based off of our conversation so far and knowing you for like 15 years or however long it's been now.
Yeah.
I would say that you are self-pres, social, sexual, in that order.
That's what I think too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It may be that way. You might be right.
But it's the reason I think that is just because I have like a sort of an energetic feel for this kind of thing. And that doesn't mean it's always right. But people who are sexual repressed just kind of feel different. They actually tend to dress a little bit more like muted colors and like neutral colors compared to someone who's not sexual repressed. Like they just have like a little bit more of a muted way of being, because they don't want to draw tons of attention to themselves. They want to be doing their thing in their
and I
place.
definitely know these kinds of fives that you're describing. The fives that are like, I don't know how to be around them.
But you're not like that, so that makes me question it.
That's true. Yeah, maybe so. Yeah.
Cody, I know that the way that you feel like internally you come across as super intense. You're
or awkward or whatever it is.
Externally, you're way more stoic than I am.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And you always have been. And so that's just based off what I know of like the sexual subtype. I feel like those two things are contradictory, like being really stoic versus more expressive.
That's true.
Right.
It definitely would be the self-pres, right? Like I'm as much as I'm putting physical walls, I'm also putting those mental and emotional walls up too.
Exactly.
So it's really hard for me to express in general, period.
Yep.
So yeah, totally. I will agree with you on the self-pres, social, sexual. That's what I had written down originally. And then I literally wrote it back and forth like twice during this conversation. Like, I don't know, maybe the problem is having to try to like visualize, like understanding in a way that I can conceptualize it, like what each looks like based on each different secondary, because it was hard for me to understand like what that looks like in daily life. But when I think of it in terms of like the fives that do stand out by not standing out, right, on purpose, like that's the intention. I've definitely known fives like that in my life. My dad's a five like that, so I would say that was definitely more like what he is. But you get him in a room one-on-one and he's a completely different person. And so but any social interaction at all in a bigger scheme, and he's like fully like pulls back. So it's fine. It's interesting. And my brother's kind of like that too. He's interesting. I would be interested to know what his stacking is, but in that way, we're vastly different. And I've always been like, I'm in a family of fives, but we're all so different. And in ways that we almost don't relate to each other in many ways. We have to work to understand each other, which has always been really interesting. But I'll agree with that stacking. We can move on. We'll check that box. We'll sign off.
Call
on
it
that
a
one.
working theory, maybe. But
yeah, working theory. I like that.
I wanted to say something real quick about what Cody just said. Something to know about subtypes is that it accounts for most, I'd say, of the variability within type. We have the wing at play too, but the way you're talking about your family, and even though we're all fives, we sort of don't get each other. I would, bet money that you're all different dominant instincts, all different
definitely.
subtypes rather. And
Yeah.
that's why. And then if you're the same type as someone, then those subtype things are going to just come out more because you have a lot already shared. And then you can express the things that aren't shared. So those probably account for a lot of the differences, the variability that we see within fives.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, let's turn it on, Josiah.
Oh, no.
Your turn.
Okay. So I'm going to do mine a little different. I'm going to start with the repressed because it's super easy for me.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So the one at the bottom of my stack is definitely self-pres.
Yes,
yeah.
I got it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yep.
High five, self-pres, repressed.
Yeah.
I hate exercising. I hate just anything that requires maintenance. I just don't want to do anything that requires maintenance, especially like my environment, my body, whatever. If I could, I would. And I used to be more like this when I was single, but if I could organize my whole life around as little maintenance as possible, I would do that because I don't want to have to deal with it.
How are you with like putting oil in your car and paying bills and like paperwork and stuff?
I set up systems to handle most of that kind of stuff. So I set up systems for my bill paying and like finances stuff. I set up systems to remind me about the things that like I have to do as much as possible. I set up systems to take care of as much of it as I can. So where I'll either like fully automate it or I'll kind of partially automate it to where I can just sort of check boxes without thinking about it. But that's how I deal with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Try to make it so you don't have to do it as much as possible.
Yep.
Yes. Hard agree.
I also relate to that though. As a self-pres dominant, I also relate to that. I try to have those same systems.
You definitely exercise a lot more than I do. And that's anytime I meet a five that is physically fit or physically active, I can't comprehend it. I don't know how they can be that way.
Yeah, well, I spent a lot of my life not being that way. It was like in the last 10 years, just like not been taking care of myself in any way, emotionally or physically. And I think that eventually all of that self-preservation that I've spent trying to cultivate an environment that I wanted had to turn on myself eventually, right? And so, and then having that reality check with my doctor of being like, if you don't lose weight, like you're going to be in serious you're getting into grounds like serious problems, like life-threatening problems. Like you need to change your entire lifestyle. So I was like, all right, I'm going to do that. And then, but what I found was I used to think that I hated working out too until I started doing it very consistently. And then I found out that I crossed that threshold that everybody always talks about where you hate it and you hate it and you hate it. And then you start associating it with the feeling afterwards. And so then you start liking it. And so now when I have a really bad day, my first thought is not I'm going to drink alcohol or I'm going to do whatever. It's like, I need to go get like a really good run out. And it helps that there's a gym literally downstairs. But yeah.
I never feel good after.
Well, the endorphins, I mean, you do. Maybe you just don't acknowledge it. It's good.
I'm always like,
have to a
oh,
little
that
bit.
sucked. I don't want to do that ever again.
So I'm also self-pres repressed, and I remember people
Okay.
talking about a runner's high, like when I was young, and I was like, there is no such thing as a runner's high.
Nope.
I would have agreed with you until very recently, like literally 2 or 3 weeks ago, because I've been doing it so consistently now that now I'm just doing it more consistently. But I was never like that before. I never agreed with that. I was like, I dread going to the gym. I hate it the whole time I'm there. And then I would like, fuck that. I never want to do that again after the gym.
Cody,
so
you're making us feel bad about ourselves.
I'm sorry. I'm just saying, like, I think anybody can get there. It's just maybe way harder for you guys.
Well, what's interesting is, so self-pres fives are different than other self-pres subtypes because they don't necessarily take care of their bodies. It's just that if you see a five who is routinely taking care of their bodies and seems to be able to do that, it's probably a self-pres five. But because we're all still fives, right? We all are like intellects, all that matters, brain, no body. Our bodies don't even matter, ignore pain, like all of that. We're all fives. But a self-pres five is going to probably find the joy faster and easier and more consistently. I do recommend, as like therapy, I recommend fives like work out with weights and like do, exercise, because it helps us all to get more embodied. But it's just, I think, a little bit easier for self-pres.
Anyway, I'm taking up Josiah's time. We need to figure out the stacking.
Okay, so you're self-pres repress for sure.
So here comes the hard part. And I think that it's difficult because it's shifted for me over the years. But as I was listening to you describe more in depth each of the types and how the second one can support the first one, I'm going to say that I'm probably, my working theory right now is that I am sexual than social.
Really?
Yeah.
Yep.
And
that was what I wrote down.
And the reason why, I'll talk through like my aversion to the accepting or embracing maybe that I might be sexual first. Is that I think it came down to how I first learned about subtypes, and I didn't go too deeply into it, which was my mistake, I guess. But it was more in the frame of, I think we talked about this in our last conversation, where it's like we withdraw, and then like the way that was framed the first time I heard about it was self-pres withdrawals within, like withdrawals into themselves. The sexual fives withdraw into someone else or outwardly, I guess.
Into a relationship. I remember.
Yeah, into a relationship. Before. Yeah. And then social fives withdraw above. And I definitely related to the social fives withdrawing above piece. And like, because I very much, I love the idea of being part of an elite group. Like I've spent thousands of dollars being in like masterminds, and like I definitely have a strong social bent in that regard. I'm also always thinking about how to navigate social situations and have grown in my skills in that regard. But what I'm realizing is that I had to make effort to grow in those skills because I couldn't be socially in a group. And it was because I would go into intense one-on-one mode and push everyone away because I was like too intense, I guess, or I would withdraw completely. Like I didn't know how to like balance in between. So I had to over the course of years build up those social skills and learn how to like navigate in a way that lets me sort of stay surface for the sake of the other person until I can find someone that I can go deep with. And I'm realizing that that's how my social has been supporting the sexual, is that when I'm in a social situation, if I'm there more, if I don't already have some other objective, like I'm there for like work or networking or something along those lines, like my objective is always to find the people that I can have a really good conversation with. But I use my social skills to kind of navigate that and test the water so that I don't scare anyone off until I can, start to find that person that I can go deep with. And the thing that I always said about, if they're kind of going back to what Cody was saying, where Like, he would implode his whole life if he could just create art. I always had trouble figuring out what I wanted to do for a living. And I could never picture myself doing any one thing for, the next 30 years. But the only thing I could come close to was the only thing I could see myself doing for long term is being able to like sit down with someone over a nice glass of whiskey and just have an amazing conversation with someone who's like really intelligent or like an expert in something or just really fascinating. And then I found podcasting, and that was like what really made me fall in love with podcasting with my last podcast, where I was just interviewing guests, and it's that one-on-one connection. But I always looked at the sexual subtype through the more romantic relationship, and I think that the challenge for me in that is that I resent needing anyone, and so if it's framed more as like I need that relationship, then I'm going to push back against that because I view myself as very self-sustaining, even though I know like logically that's probably not true. And when I'm isolated, it's really bad for me, but I like to tell myself at least that I don't need anyone else. And so I think that that's why I've not embraced the possibility that sexual is my dominant subtype.
Okay, some thoughts and questions.
Okay.
My guess was actually social sexual, but I could see either, and I was going back and forth. One thing you just said, you want to pull out a couple things. One thing you said was like the one thing I'd be fine with doing is like sitting down over a glass of whiskey and having an amazing conversation with someone who's, you said, like super intelligent and expert. That actually sounds a little bit more social.
Yeah, and I think that that's where the social comes in, and they don't have to be that. Like I can sit down with anyone who actually is interesting, like just being able to have like a really good conversation. Someone who is not afraid to explore ideas.
Yes, all of that sounds social. So I'm gonna try to talk about myself and just like melt into the floor again. But I would love to spend time sitting down with someone over a whiskey who I have like electricity with. Like it's actually not about an exchange of ideas and like admiration. It's about chemistry. So it's like I feel this like unexplainable auric chemistry with someone. Then I want to talk to them. Then we can talk about ideas, but the chemistry comes first. And when I'm looking for in a group, like you also said, and by the way, I'm not trying to argue that you're not sexual, but just
no, I want to unpack this. Yeah.
You also said like, okay, in a new group, you said if I don't have another goal like networking, am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Yes.
Okay, I never
it's encouraged.
Have a goal.
I've said fuck like twice.
Okay.
No, that's never my personal goal. It's only if it's something like I have to, like it's enforced on me.
Oh, I get it. I totally get it. However, I go to like network because I have to, and I still end up like in intense locked eye contact with someone who I'm like into, not necessarily sexually, but who I'm into like chemically. Like I'm basically incapable of not doing that. So
okay.
I think I probably a little bit oversold the idea that like socials are interested in group connection. It's like they're interested in connecting for like social cohesion, but they're not necessarily like you don't have to love groups to be social. Another thing to think about, and this would be my question for you, is about boundaries, like essentially like energetic boundaries. Self-pres fives and self-pres everyone have the most desire for boundaries. They push away the most. Whereas socials have like a bubble boundary, but they want to go and like touch their bubble to other people's bubble and like, like overlap a little bit.
Uh-huh.
It's like the COVID 6-foot rule, but with bubbles.
And then sexual fives don't want there to be a bubble at all.
Oh, God.
Right. So sexual fives, like that doesn't mean I like merging with everyone, but I don't want to have boundaries when I connect. I want to connect to the point that all the boundaries dissolve.
Okay. I don't ever like the idea of boundaries dissolving.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm a sexuality researcher. I don't know if I said that on this one. And the sexual behavior of the instincts is something that I've studied.
Mhm.
So another like way to diagnose yourself is to start like talking about sex, because people will kind of show up as more of their real self a lot
Okay.
of times. And it's the same thing with sex. Like sexual subtypes basically want to merge to the point that there's no you, there's no me, there's like no ego, there's a third entity that's like us, and there's like we're just totally merged, and then socials are more about like sex is to make us feel closer together, but we're still two separate people. I want to feel bonded to you, but it's not about merging.
And then how does self-pres show up?
Self-pres is like, make sure all my basic needs are met before I'll even think about sex. But sometimes self-pres people think of sex as a basic need, so it depends. But usually they're like fine with it, but they want enough rest, enough food, everything's like in order.
Oh, that's so true.
And then they consider that sex is an sexual context like an output of energy. So they're considering like how much energy do I want to give to it, and like do I have that energy to give, when they're sort of like deciding whether to connect that way or not.
Let's go back to the social versus sexual. You said that social, they view it more as a way to connect but still like stay separate.
Yeah, so they see them and their partner, themselves, their partner, two separate entities. Sex helps them kind of like get to know each other, what each other likes. Like it's a give and take. It's about I please you, you please me. Like that all makes our relationship better, but it's about the connection. It's not about the absence of separateness.
Okay. Yes, I'm social dominant then in that framework. Yeah. Not saying that like there are obviously times when that merging has happened and it's a euphoric experience, but it's not the goal for me.
Gotcha. Yeah. So for a sexual dominant, it would be the goal.
Okay.
Basically, they don't like anything else.
Okay. All right. Well, then
You figured it out?
I guess. Yeah. So then, well, that was my original stacking before the conversation. So that makes sense. Yeah, I think where I got hung up was around the social stuff. It's hard because, like you said, we're still fives.
Yeah.
So, like, I want to connect, and I do really value that chemistry, and that it probably makes sense that I have it as a secondary that supports then, because when I'm having a really good conversation, what energizes me after that well, you said the chemistry comes first and then the ideas. For me, usually it's the ideas and then the chemistry.
Yeah.
And those together are what really energize me. If the chemistry never comes, it's still nice, but it's not the same. But it doesn't start there. It usually almost always starts with like the ideas and how people communicate them. And if they have like an interesting way of viewing the world and that sort of thing, it's much more driven intellectually than it is chemically.
So I'm going to like expose myself in this like personal example. But I feel like an example of you kind of like using sexual to support social is even when we were first talking about the podcast with the first episode we did on sex. And I remember like when we were talking about me coming on the podcast that we could like connect on that more of like a sexual, not sex, but like a sexual wavelength. But then it was like in support of doing like something professional for like the social good. And I was positive that sexual is in your top 2 because of that. But I think based on what we're talking about now, it's probably second.
The other thing that I found really interesting, if we can dig in a little bit more, was you said that on the sexual side, they want to change people's sense of self versus on the social side, you want to change people's like views and ideas.
Yes.
So when you say change their sense of self, are you talking about experientially in the moment, or are you talking about like how they like conceptualize or intellectualize themselves?
Everything. Like basically I want my work to like enlighten people. Like so they are completely different after than from before.
Okay. Yeah, that's hard because right now I'm writing a book and I want people to walk away from the book changed. But I guess I'm not going for like a full change of their sense of self. I want them to think about things in a different way and
Yeah.
apply at least a couple of things
That's
to
more
change your
social.
perspective. Okay.
Yeah. Think about things. Yeah, that was the key right there.
Yeah.
What you said.
You guys are actually really helping me hone these descriptions because I think I didn't explain the social in such a way that you related to it. But that's because like the way the 5 mitigates it or something means that you actually prefer talking one-on-one with people, like you said, but the way you do it is more of like a social instinct way.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have all
Before
three.
we do have all three, right? We have
We have all three,
your
Dominic.
social, sexual, self-pres. Is that what you think you are?
Me, yeah. I'm
Yeah.
social,
All
sexual, self-pres.
All right, I'm going to make but I know we're going to wrap up, but I'm going to make an amendment because there's some things that you said that actually has now changed my mind on what my secondary is.
Okay.
I know we've gone back and forth for like an hour, but one of the things that is a incredibly defining factor on whether or not I'm going to interact with somebody or not is if I feel a certain connection with them. And that's something that's unusual for my personality, but it is, I'll talk to somebody forever. And it's not because I find them interesting from the beginning. It's because I feel a certain like connection and chemistry with them.
Okay.
And so that makes me wonder if there is more of like a sexual secondary, because I'll define who I interact with and who I'm friends with based on that. Like in general, whether it is physical attraction or if it's just like general attraction to who they are, some kind of weird, like I've always been able to sense like an unsaid or undefined connection with people, right? That makes me want to have a conversation with them. It makes me want to connect with them. And that has always been the deciding factor on whether or not I'm going to like want to interact with them or not. It has nothing to do with what they know or what I want to learn from them or any of those things or where they are in the ladder. You know, if it doesn't matter socially where they are, if I don't feel like I can connect with them, then I immediately don't know how to connect with them. So I don't know how to have a conversation with them. So I pull back instead and I'm like, nah, they're not my people. I say that a lot. And so in that way, and that's why I feel like a lot of times it isn't like, you know, I always say that I get along with 5s, but it's actually only specific 5s that I really get along with. And it's usually people that I have a certain chemistry with. And whether that's developed like me and Josiah over 15 years but we had that when we first met too. We had to overcome a lot of obstacles to get there in the beginning that were put there, as we've talked about in the past, I think. But there is that defining factor for me that kind of makes me lean into that more than the social. Because a lot of things you've been talking about with social with him, I don't understand and I don't agree with at all. And I'm like, does not compute, right? So
Okay. And if that's the case, then you would be social repressed if
Yeah.
you're self-pres and then sexual. And then a good deal of the things you said would fit that. Like, again, when you said, like, I'll just talk until, like, people wish I'm dead. Like, that's something that probably a social repressed person would do because they just wouldn't know when to stop.
Right. And I think that I've just adapted, right? Like I've adapted because I've chosen very consciously to care about how other people feel. But sometimes, not even sometimes, most of the time, I still have to check in consciously with the situation to be like, oh shit, yeah, no, they're not engaged anymore. I need to stop. But it's like, it's usually after the fact. It's not leading into it that I realize those things.
Yeah.
So the more that I think about it, I'm like, yeah, no, I'm definitely socially repressed, which also fuels my theory going into this that Josiah and I are exact opposites, which is we are opposites on the spectrum too, on like horizontally. He's a 6 or a 5 wing 4. I'm a 5 wing 6.
Right.
And so I've always thought that we're opposites in every way that a 5 can be, and which balances the conversation really well. But it is funny that I think it is that, because like a lot of the ways that he is dominant, I've never been able to relate to at all.
That's a great point.
So anyway, well, cool. This has been super fun. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Yes. We could definitely keep going.
Yeah. So we have, the 3 different subtypes of 5 on right now. So I guess like if we each explained like what being a 5 feels like, it would actually be 3 different ways, even though we're all 5s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. What was your full stacking? You said you're sexually dominant, but which one was
sexual, secondary? Social, and then self-preservation repressed.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I remember we had that conversation. Okay.
Sam, this has been fantastic. We've loved this conversation. We really appreciate you coming on. And I just want to give you the opportunity before we hop off here. Any last kind of parting words of wisdom or insights for us?
I guess this maybe is like a whole different episode, but I'll just say a quickly that my work is with sex and relationships, primarily sex and sexuality. And the instincts, the subtypes, and even your stacking really impacts how you connect in intimate relationship, in any relationship. So Cody was talking about how your stackings are opposite. So that's going to affect how you connect. Like in our romantic partnerships, if you have, say, stackings where you share a dominant instinct, then that instinct tends to be like way overused. Whereas the other two are sort of like ignored. And then if you have like totally different stackings from your partner, you'll sort of meet in the one that overlaps in your dominant and secondary. And then you might feel really misunderstood and you're dominant and repressed. So something I'm really interested right now in my work is like how to expand relationships into all three areas, especially the ones where we're repressed, because if you work a lot on developing your repressed one, you can become more balanced. So I guess my note is just like, this is actually quite important for how relationships function. So if you can figure out your stacking, and then if you have a partner, you can figure out your partner stacking, you can start to use it for growth and for building intimacy.
Awesome. Yeah, you've definitely given us a lot to think about. We're gonna I know I'm gonna be quizzing Amy and trying to dig into the stackings for fours, because she's a 4. So I want to make sure this time, because last time I spaced and completely forgot. I want to make sure to tell everyone to go follow you. Your work is amazing. I thoroughly enjoy it. I also don't know how you put out so much Instagram content, because I like going back, even though I guess now I will say I can confidently say I'm social dominant. I still hate the upkeep of putting out Instagram content and just dealing with social media in general.
Oh, I hate it too. I'm doing actually a lot less than the marketing person I talked to told me to. So that's nice and reassuring. Thanks.
So everyone needs to go follow you, follow your work, connect if they're interested in working with you. So where can everybody connect with you online?
Follow me on Instagram. That's where I put out the most content. That's at Enneagasm, ENNEA_GASM. And that's mostly Enneagram and sexuality content, although I do have a good deal of stuff on subtypes right now. And then my website is enneagramsexpert.com.
Awesome. And we'll make sure to link all of that up in the show notes so you guys can click on that and go connect with Sam. Once again, thanks so much. This has been a great conversation, and looking forward to many more in the future. Hey, it's Josiah, and I wanted to say thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this episode and you're the type of person who likes helping others, would you do us a favor and share it with other people like you? If you found value in this conversation, they will too. I also want to give a special thanks to our community members who shared their voice with us in this episode. If anything in this conversation has resonated with you, or if you have any further thoughts or questions, I want to invite you to join our community of other people like you and continue the conversation at enneagram5.com.